This is from Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers by Mary Roach, Chapter 9. Recognize that guy? 9. Just Ahead. Decapitation, reanimation, and the human head transplant. If you really wanted to know for sure that the human soul resides in the brain, you could cut off a man's head and ask it. You would have to ask quickly, for the human brain cut off from its blood supply will slide into unconsciousness after 10 or 12 seconds. You would, further, have to instruct the man to answer with blinks, for having been divorced from his lungs, he can pull no air through his larynx and thus can no longer speak. But it could be done. And if the man seemed more or less the same individual he was before you cut off his head, perhaps a little less calm, then you would know that indeed the self is there in the brain. In Paris, in 1795, an experiment very much like this was nearly undertaken. 4 years before, the guillotine had replaced the noose as the executioner's official tool. The device was named after Joseph Ignatz Guillotine, though he did not invent it. He merely lobbied for its use on the grounds that the decapitating machine, as he preferred to call it, was an instantaneous and thus more humane way to kill. And then he read this. Do you know that it is not all certain when a head is severed from the body by the guillotine that the feelings, personality, and ego are instantaneously abolished? Don't you know that the seat of the feelings and appreciation is in the brain, that this seat of consciousness can continue to operate even when the circulation of blood is cut off from the brain? Thus, for as long as the brain retains its vital force, the victim is aware of his existence. Remember that Haller insists that a head, having been removed from the shoulders of a man, grimaced horribly when a surgeon who was present stuck a finger into the Raykedon canal. Furthermore, credible witnesses have assured me that they have seen the teeth grind after the head has been separated from the trunk. And I am convinced that if the air could still circulate through the organs of the voice, these heads would speak. The guillotine is a terrible torture. We must return to hanging. It was a letter, published in the November 9th, 1795 Paris Moniteur, written by the well-respected German anatomist St. Sommering. Guillotine was horrified. The Paris medical community a Twitter. Jean-Joseph Sue, the librarian at the Paris School of Medicine, came out in agreement with Sommering, declaring that his belief that heads could see, hear, smell, see, and think. He tried to convince his colleagues to undertake an experiment whereby, before the butchery of the victim, a few of the unfortunate's friends would arrange a code of eyelid or jaw movements which the head could use after the execution to indicate whether it was fully conscious of its agony. Sue's colleagues in the medical community dismissed his idea as ghastly and absurd, and the experiment was not carried out. Nonetheless, the notion of the living head had made its way into the public consciousness, and even popular literature. Below is a conversation between a pair of fictional executioners in Alexander Dumas's Mille et une Fantômes. Phantom something. Do you believe that they're dead because they've been guillotined? Undoubtedly. Well, one can see that you don't look in the basket when they are all there together. You've never seen them twist their eyes and grind their teeth for a good 5 minutes after the execution. We are forced to change the basket every 3 months because they cause so much damage to the bottom. Shortly after Sommering and Sue's pronouncements, George Martin, an assistant to the official Paris executioner and witness to some 120 beheadings, was interviewed on the subject of the heads and their post-execution activities. Sobrian writes that he cast his lot, not surprisingly, on the side of instantaneous death. He claimed to have viewed all 120 heads within 2 seconds, and always the eyes were fixed. The immobility of the lids was total. The lips were already white. Medical science was, for the moment, reassured, and the furor dissipated. But French science was not through with heads. A physiologist named Legalios surmised in an 1812 paper that if personality did indeed reside in the brain, it should be possible to revive by giving it an injection of oxygenated blood through its severed cerebral arteries. If a physiologist attempted this experiment on the head of a guillotined man a few instants after death, wrote Legalosi's colleague, Professor Volpian, he would perhaps bear witness to a terrible sight. Theoretically, for as long as the blood supply lasted, the head would be able to think, hear, see, smell, grind its teeth, twist its eyes, chew up the lab table, for all the nerves above the neck would still be intact and attached to the organs and muscles of the head. The head wouldn't be able to speak, owing to the aforementioned disabling of the larynx, but this was probably, from the perspective of the experimenter, just as well. Legalos lacked either the resources or the intestinal fortitude to follow through with the actual experiment, but other researchers did not. In 1857, the French physician Brown Séquard cut the head off a dog to see if he could put it back in action with arterial injections of oxygenated blood. 8 minutes after the head parted company with the neck, the injections began. 2 or 3 minutes later, Brown Séquard noticed movements of the eyes and facial muscles that appeared to him to be voluntarily directed. Clearly, something was going on in the animal's brain. With the steady supply of guillotine heads in Paris, it was only a matter of time before someone tried this out on a human. There could be only one man for the job, a man who would more than once make a name for himself, lots of names probably, by doing peculiar things to bodies with the aim of resuscitating them. The man for the job was Jean-Baptiste Vincent Laborde, the very same Jean-Baptiste Vincent Laborde who appeared earlier in these pages advocating prolonged tongue-pulling as a means of reviving a comatose mistaken for dead patient. In 1884, the French authorities began supplying Laborde with the heads of guillotine prisoners so that he could examine the state of their brain and nervous system. Reports of these experiments appeared in various French medical journals. It was hoped that Laborde would get to the bottom of what he called la terrible legende, that it was possible for guillotined heads to be aware, if only for a moment, of their situation in a basket without a body. Upon a head's arrival in his lab, he would quickly bore holes in the skull and insert needles into the brain in an attempt to trigger nervous system responses. Following Brown Séquard's lead, he also tried resuscitating the heads with a supply of blood. Laborde's first subject was a murderer named Campi. From Laborde's description, he was not a typical thug. He had delicate ankles and white manicured hands. His skin was unblemished save for an abrasion on the left cheek, which Laborde surmised was the result of the head's drop into the guillotine basket. Laborde didn't typically spend so much time personalizing his subjects, preferring to call them simply restes frais. The term means, literally, fresh remains, though in French it has a pleasant culinary lilt, like something you might order off the specials board at the neighborhood bistro. Campi arrived in 2 pieces, and he arrived late. Under ideal circumstances, the distance from the scaffold to Laborde's lab on Rue Vanclin could be covered in about 7 minutes. Campi's commute took an hour and 20 minutes, owing to what Laborde called that stupid law forbidding scientists to take possession of the remains of executed criminals until the bodies had crossed the threshold of the city cemetery. This meant Laborde's driver had to follow the heads as they made the sentimental journey to the turnip field, if my French serves, and then pack them up and bring them all the way back across town to the lab. Needless to say, Campi's brain had long since ceased to function in anything close to a normal state. Infuriated by the waste of 80 critical postmortem minutes, Laborde decided to meet his next head at the cemetery gates and set directly to work on it. He and his assistants rigged a makeshift traveling laboratory in the back of a horse-drawn van, complete with lab table, 5 stools, candles, and the necessary equipment. The second subject was named Gamahut, a fact unlikely to be forgotten owing to the man's having had his name tattooed on his torso. Eerily, as though presaging his gory fate, he had also been tattooed with a portrait of himself from the neck up, which, without the lines of a frame to suggest an unseen body, gave him the appearance of a floating head. Within minutes of its arrival in the van, Gamahut's head was installed in a septic-lined container, and the men set to work, drilling holes in the skull and inserting needles into various regions of the brain to see if they could coax any activity out of the criminal's moribund nervous system. The ability to perform brain surgery while traveling full tilt on a cobblestone street is a testament to the steadiness of Laborde's hand and/or the craftsmanship of 19th century Brogans. Had the vehicle's manufacturers known, they might have crafted a persuasive ad campaign, a la the diamond cutter in the back seat of the smooth-riding Oldsmobile. Laborde's team ran current through the needles, and Gamahut could be seen to make the predictable twitches of lip and jaw. At one point, to the astonished shouts of all the present, The prisoner slowly opened one eye, as if with great and understandable trepidation he sought to figure out where he was and what sort of strange locality hell had turned out to be. But of course, given the amount of time that had elapsed, the movement could have been nothing beyond primitive reflex. The third time around, Laborde resorted to basic bribery to expedite his head deliveries. With the help of the local municipality chief, the third head, that of a man named Gagny, was delivered to his lab just shy of 7 minutes after the chop. The arteries on the right side of the neck were injected with oxygenated cow's blood, and in a break from Brown-Séquard's protocol, the arteries on the other side were connected to those of a living animal. Laborde had an arresting flair for details, which the medical journals of his day seemed pleased to accommodate. He devoted a full paragraph to an artful description of a severed head resting upright on the lab table, rocking ever so slightly left and right from the pulsing pressure of the dog's blood as it pumped into the head. In another paper, he took pains to detail the post-mortem contents of Gamahut's excretory organs, though the information bore no relation to the experiment at hand, noting with seeming fascination that the stomach and intestines were completely empty, save for un petit bouchon fécal at the far end. A little poop. With the Gagny head, Laborde came closest to restoring normal brain function. Muscles on the eyelids, forehead, and jaw could be made to contract. At one point, Gagny's jaw snapped shut so forcefully that a loud claquement d'internere was heard. However, given that 20 minutes had passed from the drop of the blade to the infusion of blood, an irreversible brain death sets in after 6 to 10 minutes, it is certain that Gagny's brain was too far gone to be brought around to anything resembling consciousness, and he remained blessedly ignorant of his dismaying state of affairs. The Chine, on the other hand, spent its final, decidedly less vigorous minutes watching its blood pump into someone else's head, and no doubt produced some claquements dentaires of its own. Oops. Laborde soon lost interest in heads, but a team of French experimenters named Hayem and Barrier took up where he left off. The two became something of a cottage industry, transfusing a total of 22 dog heads, using blood from live horses and dogs. They built a tabletop guillotine specially fitted to the canine neck and published papers on the 3 phases of neurological activity following decapitation. Monsieur Guillotine would have been deeply chagrined to read the concluding statements in Hayem and Barrier's descriptions of the initial, or convulsive, post-decapitation phase. The physiognomy of the head, they wrote, expresses surprise and appears to be conscious of the exterior world for 3 or 4 seconds. 18 years later, a French physician by the name of Bourrieu confirmed Hayem and Barrier's observations and Sommering's suspicions. Using Paris's public scaffold as his lab, he carried out a series of simple observations and experiments on the head of a prisoner named Languille, the instant after the guillotine blade dropped.